Sometimes the hardest thing about getting old isn't aching bones or failing eyesight. It's watching everything you've built slip away. Silas Boone had made peace with losing his ranch, his cattle, even his beloved wife Clara to Wyoming Territory. But when his loyal dog Duke started digging near an old cedar stump, Silas discovered something that would shake him to his core. Beneath the weathered wood lay eggs, unlike anything he'd seen in 60 years of ranching. When they hatched, the creatures inside bore an unsettling resemblance to Clara herself. Terrified and bewildered, the aging cattleman made a decision that baffled everyone. He shut down his ranch for good. What could possibly frighten a man who'd survived decades on the frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of the Boone ranch house, its light catching the dust motes that danced through gaps in the shutters. Silas Boone stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the vast expanse of Wyoming Territory stretch toward the horizon. At 63, his shoulders bore the weight of decades spent working this unforgiving land. His back, permanently curved from years of wrestling cattle and mending fences under the relentless prairie sun. The ranch had seen better days, much better days. What once sprawled across 3,000 acres now barely covered 800. The rest sold off piece by piece over the past 5 years just to keep food on the table and hay in the barn. The remaining cattle, maybe 40 head if he was being generous, grazed in the near pasture, their ribs showing despite his best efforts to keep them fed through the harsh winter that had finally broken. Duke, his blue heeler, lay stretched across the front porch, his graying muzzle resting on his paws as he kept watch over the property. The dog had been with Silas for 8 years now, ever since Clara brought him home as a pup, claiming they needed something to bring life back to the ranch after the war took so much out of them. Duke had been Clara's dog first, really, following her around the kitchen and garden, but after she passed 3 years ago, the animal had transferred his loyalty to Silas with the kind of devotion that made a man's chest tight with gratitude and grief in equal measure. Silas touched the chain around his neck, feeling the familiar weight of Clara's wedding ring resting against his chest beneath his flannel shirt. He'd worn it there every day since the fever took her, unable to bring himself to remove it from his finger where it had sat for 37 years of marriage. The simple gold band had grown thin with wear, just like everything else in his life, but it remained the most precious thing he owned, Clara. Boone had been the kind of woman who could gentle a spooked horse with whispered words and heal a man's soul with nothing, more than the way she hummed while kneading bread. She'd come west from Ohio with her parents in 62, a slip of a girl with dark hair and eyes the color of sage honey. Silas had been 26 then, recently returned from his service in the Union Army, carrying wounds that went deeper than the scar on his left shoulder from a Confederate musket ball. The ranch had been his father's then, a thriving operation with good grazing land and hopes for the future. He'd courted Clara for 2 years before working up the courage to propose. Certain a woman of her quality would never want to tie herself to a broken-down soldier with dirt under his fingernails and nightmares that woke him screaming. But Clara had seen something in him worth saving, and she devoted herself to the task with the same gentle persistence she brought to tending her garden. Their early years together had been golden ones. The ranch prospered, the cattle multiplied, and Clara filled their home with laughter and the smell of fresh-baked bread. She'd given him 7 years of marriage before the first miscarriage, then another 5 before they'd stopped hoping for children altogether. But Clara never blamed him, never turned bitter or resentful. Instead, she'd poured her maternal instincts into the ranch hands who came and went, the neighbors who needed help, and eventually into Duke when he arrived as a wriggling ball of fur and energy. The drought of 79 had started the decline. 3 years without proper rain, watching the grass turn brown and the creek beds crack like old leather. They'd sold the first parcel of land that winter, the northeast section, where Clara used to pick wild berries. By 82, they'd let go the last of their hired help, unable to afford wages for men when there was barely enough work to justify their presence. Then came Clara's illness. It started as a cough that lingered too long after a cold, then fatigue that rest couldn't cure. The doctor in town had been kind but honest. Consumption had taken hold, and there was little they could do but make her comfortable and pray for a miracle that never came. Silas had spent their savings on medicines that didn't work and treatments that only delayed the inevitable. When Clara passed on a snowy February morning, she'd taken with her not just his heart, but his will to fight for a ranch that seemed determined to die along with her. Now, 3 years later, Silas found himself going through the motions of ranch life without much purpose beyond habit. He fed the cattle because they needed feeding, mended fences because they needed mending, and kept the house clean because Clara would have expected it of him. But the fire had gone out of him, along with her final breath, leaving behind a man who functioned but didn't truly live. Duke stirred on the porch, his ears pricking forward at something Silas couldn't hear. The dog had been acting strangely for the past week or so, spending long hours staring toward the old cedar stump near the creek, whining softly as if he could see something that remained invisible to human eyes. Silas had initially attributed it to the dog's advancing age. At 8 years old, Duke was entering his senior years, and perhaps his mind was beginning to wander the way old minds sometimes did. But there was something different about this behavior, something that nagged at the back of Silas's consciousness like a splinter he couldn't quite locate. Duke wasn't confused or disoriented. He was alert, focused, almost expectant. It was the same way he'd acted the week before Clara died, sitting by her bedside and staring at empty corners as if he could see visitors that remained invisible to everyone else. The morning routine called, regardless of mysterious dog behavior or melancholy reflections. Silas pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp air that still carried winter's bite despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived. Duke immediately rose to his feet, tail wagging with the kind of enthusiasm that seemed forced, artificial somehow. "Come on, boy," Silas said, his voice rough from disuse. "Let's go check on those cattle." They walked together across the barnyard, Duke trotting alongside with his usual energy, but casting frequent glances toward the cedar stump. The old tree had been struck by lightning years ago, leaving behind only a weathered stump about 4 feet high and 3 feet across. Clara had loved that spot, often sitting on the stump to watch the sunset while Silas finished his evening chores. He'd avoided the area since her death, finding it too painful to remember her there with the golden light in her hair and that gentle smile on her lips. The cattle were where he'd left them the evening before, huddled together in the shelter of the barn's windbreak. They looked up as he approached, their eyes holding the patient resignation of animals who understood their lot in life without complaint. Silas counted them automatically, 38 head. Down 2 from the previous week when he'd sold a pair of yearlings to cover the feed bill. As he went about his morning tasks, filling water troughs and spreading hay, Silas found his attention drawn repeatedly to Duke's behavior. The dog performed his usual duties, helping to move the cattle, checking the fence line, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Every few minutes he would stop and stare toward the creek, sometimes taking a few steps in that direction before seeming to remember his responsibilities and returning to Silas's side. By midday, Silas's curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. After a simple lunch of beans and cornbread, he decided to investigate whatever had captured Duke's attention. The dog seemed to sense his intention, immediately becoming more animated and trotting ahead toward the old cedar stump. As they approached the familiar landmark, Silas felt an odd sensation, like the air itself was holding its breath. The stump sat exactly as it had for the past 15 years, weathered and scarred but solid, surrounded by the new grass of spring. Duke circled it twice, whining softly before sitting down and staring at Silas with an expression of expectation. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked, running his hand over the rough bark. What's got you so worked up about this old thing?" The dog barked once, sharp and urgent, then began pawing at the base of the stump where the roots disappeared into the earth. Silas knelt beside him, brushing away loose dirt and old leaves, and felt his heart skip when his fingers encountered something unexpected, something warm and smooth hidden beneath the natural debris. The afternoon sun seemed to dim as Silas cleared away more dirt, revealing the edge of something that definitely didn't belong in the Wyoming wilderness. Something that would change the trajectory of his quiet, grief-stricken life in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. What Silas uncovered beneath the cedar stump defied every bit of practical knowledge he'd accumulated in 63 years of frontier living. 3 eggs, each roughly the size of a man's fist, nestled in a carefully arranged bed of dried grass and soft moss. But these weren't chicken eggs or duck eggs or any kind of bird eggs he'd ever seen. The shells gleamed with an opalescent quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dappled sunlight, displaying colors that had no names, blues that weren't quite blue, greens that held depths of gold, purples that whispered of twilight skies. Duke whined again, pressing his nose toward the nest, but not quite touching it, as if some invisible barrier prevented him from making contact. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated over the past hour, alternating between excited whimpers and low, warning growls that seemed directed at nothing in particular. Silas reached out tentatively, his weathered fingers hovering inches above the nearest egg. The air around them felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. When he finally made contact, the shell was warm to the touch. Not the cool temperature he'd expected from something buried in the earth, but genuinely warm, as if heated by some internal fire. "What in the Sam Hill?" he muttered, lifting the egg carefully from its nest. It was heavier than its size suggested, and he could swear he felt something moving inside, a gentle shifting that spoke of life waiting to emerge. The shell felt almost metallic beneath his calloused palms, smooth as riverstone, but with an odd give to it, like leather that had been polished to an impossible shine. Duke barked sharply, causing Silas to nearly drop the egg. The dog was staring at something beyond the stump, his hackles raised and his body rigid with tension. Silas followed his gaze, but saw nothing except the familiar landscape of his property, the creek meandering toward the distant hills, the pasture where his cattle grazed, the weathered barn that had sheltered 3 generations of livestock. But something felt wrong. The afternoon had grown too quiet, as if every bird and insect in the territory had suddenly decided to hold its breath. Even the wind had died, leaving the prairie grass motionless and the cottonwood leaves hanging limp on their branches. The silence pressed against Silas's ears with an almost physical weight. He carefully placed the first egg back in its nest and examined the other 2. They were identical in size and appearance, their surfaces reflecting light in ways that seemed to change depending on the angle of observation. When he held his hand above them, he could feel warmth radiating upward, and something else, a vibration so subtle it was barely perceptible, like a heartbeat slowed to match the rhythm of seasons rather than seconds. "Somebody's idea of a joke," Silas said aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. "And gotta be some traveling show lost a few props." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang false. No traveling show had ever carried anything like these eggs, and no earthly creature had ever laid them. The logical part of his mind, the part that had survived war and drought and the daily hardships of frontier life, suggested he should destroy them immediately. Whatever they were, they didn't belong on his land, and experience had taught him that anything strange or unnatural usually brought trouble in its wake. He could smash them with his boot heel and bury the remains, pretend he'd never found them at all. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant since Clara's death, felt drawn to the mysterious eggs with an intensity that surprised him. They represented something beyond the ordinary, something that suggested the world might hold wonders he'd forgotten existed. In his grief-numbed existence, that possibility felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Duke's agitation was increasing by the minute. The dog paced in tight circles around the stump, occasionally pausing to stare at the eggs with what could only be described as reverence, then resuming his nervous patrol. His behavior reminded Silas of the way wild animals acted before a storm, sensing changes in the atmosphere that remained invisible to human perception. As the afternoon wore on, Silas found himself unable to leave the eggs unguarded. Something about abandoning them felt wrong, almost sinful. He told himself he was simply being cautious, making sure no predators discovered the nest before he could decide what to do with its contents. But the truth was more complicated than that. The eggs seemed to call to him on a level deeper than rational thought, awakening protective instincts he hadn't felt since Clara's illness, when the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold. Silas made a decision that went against every practical instinct he possessed. He couldn't leave the eggs exposed to the elements overnight, and he couldn't abandon them to whatever fate awaited unprotected mysteries in the wilderness. With careful hands, he lifted each egg from its nest and cradled them against his chest, feeling their warmth seep through his shirt to his skin. "Come on, Duke," he said, his voice hoarse with uncertainty. "We're taking these to the house." The dog immediately ceased his pacing and fell into step beside Silas, but his alertness never wavered. His head swiveled constantly, scanning the landscape for threats that existed only in his canine perception. The walk back to the ranch house felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the sense that they were crossing some invisible threshold from which there would be no return. Inside the house, Silas faced the question of where to keep his strange discovery. The eggs needed warmth, that much was obvious, but they also needed protection. After several minutes of consideration, he decided on the spare bedroom, the room he and Clara had always intended for children who never came. It had a southern exposure that caught the afternoon sun, and a sense of waiting that seemed appropriate for creatures preparing to be born. He arranged the eggs in a nest of Clara's old quilts, positioning them near the window where they could catch the last rays of sunlight. As he worked, he found himself humming an old tune Clara used to sing while tending her garden. And for the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel entirely empty. Duke refused to leave the doorway, lying down with his head on his paws, but his eyes fixed on the eggs. His vigil had become absolute, unwavering, as if he understood the importance of what they were protecting better than Silas did. That night, Silas dreamed of Clara for the first time since her funeral. In the dream, she was sitting on the old cedar stump, her hair golden in the setting sun, smiling at him with the same gentle expression she'd worn on their wedding day. When he tried to approach her, she held up one hand to stop him, then pointed toward the house with the other. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite hear, but her meaning was clear. The eggs were important, more important than he could possibly understand. He woke before dawn with tears on his cheeks and a certainty in his heart that his life was about to change in ways that would test everything he thought he knew about the world. Outside his bedroom window, Duke was barking at something in the distance, his voice carrying across the prairie with an urgency that made Silas's blood run cold. The eggs were beginning to crack. Silas rushed to the spare bedroom, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The eggs had developed hairline fractures overnight, delicate spiderweb patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. He knelt beside the makeshift nest, studying the changes with the intensity of a man witnessing a miracle he couldn't quite believe. The cracks were spreading even as he watched, growing longer and more intricate with each passing moment. From somewhere deep within each egg came a sound like distant wind chimes, so soft he had to hold his breath to hear it. Duke pressed against his shoulder, whimpering quietly, his entire body trembling with nervous energy. "Easy, boy," Silas whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort the dog or himself. "Whatever's happening, we'll see it through together over the next 3 days." Silas found himself spending every waking moment in the spare bedroom, leaving only when absolutely necessary to tend to his cattle or fix a meal he barely tasted. He'd pulled Clara's rocking chair from the living room and positioned it beside the window, where he could keep constant watch over the eggs while the afternoon sun warmed them through the glass. The cracks continued to spread with agonizing slowness, and Silas began to worry that the eggs might be too cool despite the sunlight. Searching through Clara's belongings, he found her favorite shawl, a soft woolen thing, the color of autumn leaves that she'd worn on cool evenings when they sat together on the front porch. He draped it carefully over the eggs, and the warmth it retained seemed to accelerate whatever process was occurring within. His dreams had become more vivid and frequent, filled with visions of Clara that felt more real than his waking hours. She would appear at different ages, sometimes as the young woman he'd married, sometimes as she'd been in their middle years when her hair had begun to silver. Occasionally, as she'd looked near the end, worn thin by illness but still beautiful in ways that made his chest ache. Always, she would smile at him with infinite patience, point toward the eggs, and mouth words he couldn't quite understand. The ranch began to suffer from his inattention. He forgot to check the water troughs for 2 days running, only remembering when he found his cattle clustered around the well, lowing with thirst. The fence in the south pasture had developed a gap that allowed 3 head to wander onto his neighbor's property, creating an embarrassing situation that required him to spend an afternoon tracking them down and making apologies. His neighbor, Tom Crawley, had studied him with the kind of concern reserved for friends who were clearly losing their grip on reality. "You feeling all right, Silas?" Tom had asked, his weathered face creased with worry. "Been meaning to stop by more often since Clara passed, but Martha's been poorly, and you know how it is." "I'm fine," Silas had replied, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Just been distracted by some projects around the house." Tom's eyes had searched his face with the practiced gaze of a man who'd known him for 20 years. "You sure? You look like you haven't been sleeping much." And Duke there seems mighty agitated about something. It was true. Duke had grown increasingly protective of the house, positioning himself on the front porch like a sentry and barking at shadows that seemed to move when they shouldn't. The dog had lost weight despite eating normally, his nervous energy burning through calories as if he were running miles every day instead of maintaining his anxious vigil. "Duke's getting old," Silas had said. "Sometimes old dogs get peculiar ideas." But he knew Duke's behavior had nothing to do with age. If anything, the dog seemed more alert and focused than he'd been in years, his attention completely consumed by whatever threat or promise the eggs represented. At night, Duke would pace the hallway outside the spare bedroom, occasionally scratching at the door when Silas forgot to leave it open. On the 4th morning, Silas woke to find one of the eggs glowing with a soft, pearl-like luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. The cracks had spread until they formed an intricate pattern resembling ancient symbols, or perhaps stars charting courses across an alien sky. When he touched the shell gently with his fingertip, it was warm enough to be concerning, but not uncomfortably hot. The sound from within had grown stronger too, no longer resembling wind chimes, but something more rhythmic, more purposeful. It reminded him of a heartbeat, but one that followed a different cadence than any earthly creature he'd ever known. The other 2 eggs showed similar changes, though each seemed to be progressing at its own pace, as if the beings within were individuals with their own sense of timing. Silas found himself talking to the eggs as he would have spoken to Clara during her illness, offering gentle encouragement and sharing fragments of his daily routine. He told them about the weather, described the cattle and their individual personalities, recounted memories of better times when the ranch had been full of life and promise. Sometimes he imagined he could feel a response, a subtle shift in the rhythm of their internal sounds, as if they were listening and somehow understanding. His neglect of the ranch grew more obvious as the days passed. He missed the weekly trip to town for supplies, forgot to repair a broken gate that allowed his cattle to cluster around the barn instead of spreading across the pasture. and completely ignored the growing pile of bills that had accumulated on his kitchen table. None of it seemed important compared to the miracle unfolding in the spare bedroom. The changes weren't limited to the eggs themselves. The entire house felt different, charged with an energy that made the air shimmer on still days and caused shadows to fall in directions that defied the sun's position. Plants that Clara had tended began growing with unusual vigor, despite the fact that Silas hadn't watered them in weeks. The old grandfather clock in the hallway, which had kept perfect time for 30 years, began gaining several minutes each day, as if time itself was moving differently within the walls of the ranch house. Duke's protective instincts had evolved into something approaching desperation. He no longer left the property at all, not even to chase the jackrabbits that had always been his favorite quarry. Instead, he maintained his vigil with single-minded intensity, sleeping in short intervals and always with one ear tuned to the spare bedroom. When neighbors approached the house, he would position himself between them and the front door, not aggressively, but with unmistakable determination. On the 7th day since the eggs began cracking, Silas woke from a dream so vivid it left him disoriented. Clara had been standing in the doorway of the spare bedroom, no longer pointing toward the eggs, but holding her arms, as if cradling something precious against her chest. Her lips had moved with unusual clarity, and this time he'd heard her words. "They're almost ready, my love. Almost ready to come home." The hatching began at 3 in the morning on a moonless night, when the entire world seemed wrapped in velvet darkness. Silas jerked awake to the sound of Duke whimpering outside his bedroom door, a sound unlike anything he'd heard from the dog before. Part excitement, part reverence, part fear. He pulled on his clothes and followed Duke down the hallway, his bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. The spare bedroom glowed with soft, ethereal light emanating from the eggs themselves. The largest of the three had developed a crack that ran completely around its circumference, like a doorway preparing to open. As Silas watched, frozen in the doorway, the top half began to shift and separate, moving with deliberate purpose rather than the random. Breaking, he might have expected. What emerged defied every expectation he might have formed. During his week of vigil, the creature that pushed its way free of the shell was roughly the size of a house cat. But there any similarity to earthly animals ended. Its skin was translucent, revealing a network of veins that pulsed with the same pearl-like luminescence the eggs had displayed. 4 legs ended in delicate, almost hand-like appendages, while a graceful neck supported a head that made Silas's breath catch in his throat. The face that looked up at him was unmistakably feminine, with features so familiar they caused his heart to skip several beats. High cheekbones, a gently curved nose, eyes that held depths of intelligence and compassion. It was Clara's face, refined and perfected, as if her essence had been distilled into something both more and less than human. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Silas whispered, sinking to his knees beside the nest. The creature, he couldn't think of it as anything else, though no earthly taxonomy would have known what to do with it, turned its attention to him with obvious recognition. When it opened its mouth, the sound that emerged wasn't quite speech, but carried meaning nonetheless, a musical language that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his heart. He understood somehow that it was greeting him, acknowledging him as the one who had protected and nurtured its development. The second egg cracked open with a sound like crystal singing, revealing another creature identical to the first in form but subtly different in presence. This one's eyes held more of Clara's gentle humor, while its movements suggested the kind of playful energy she'd displayed when tending her garden or fussing over Duke as a puppy. The third creature emerged with quiet dignity, its expression more serious, more contemplative. As it studied Silas with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, he felt the distinct impression that it was evaluating him, measuring his character against some standard he couldn't begin to understand. Duke crept forward on his belly, approaching the creatures with the same reverence he'd shown for Clara during her final days. They seemed to recognize him as a friend and protector, each taking a moment to nuzzle against his graying muzzle with obvious affection. The dog's tail wagged with joy, but quietly, as if he understood the solemnity of the moment. The eggshells themselves proved as remarkable as the creatures they'd contained. As Silas examined the remnants, he discovered intricate patterns etched into their inner surfaces, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, creating the illusion of depth and movement. Some resembled astronomical charts showing the paths of celestial bodies across unknown skies. Others suggested maps of territories that existed nowhere on Earth, with rivers that flowed uphill and mountain ranges that formed geometric shapes too perfect to be natural. When he touched one of the shell fragments, images flashed through his mind with startling clarity. He saw vast prairies under skies of impossible colors, herds of creatures that moved like liquid light across distances that stretched beyond horizons. He glimpsed cities built from materials that seemed to grow rather than being constructed, their spires reaching towards stars arranged in patterns that had never shone above Wyoming Territory. The creatures watched his exploration of their former homes with patient interest, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested communication beyond human perception. They were clearly intelligent, more intelligent than any earthly animal, but their intelligence operated according to principles he couldn't begin to fathom. As the night progressed, Silas found himself caught between wonder and terror. The rational part of his mind insisted that what he was witnessing was impossible, that creatures like these couldn't exist in a world governed by natural law and scientific understanding. But a deeper part of him, the part that had always believed Clara was too good for this world, recognized something profoundly right about their presence. The creatures showed no interest in leaving the spare bedroom, seeming content to explore their immediate surroundings with the careful curiosity of beings encountering a new environment. They moved with fluid grace, their translucent bodies catching and reflecting the moonlight that began filtering through the window as dawn approached. When one of them accidentally knocked over Clara's sewing basket, it paused in obvious distress, carefully replacing each scattered item with delicate precision. That gesture, more than any other, convinced Silas that these beings possessed not just intelligence, but compassion, a moral sense that placed them closer to angels than animals. They seemed to understand the importance of the room's contents, treating Clara's belongings with the kind of respect reserved for sacred objects. As the sun rose, casting the first rays of morning light across the nested creatures, Silas made a decision that would have seemed insane just a week earlier. Whatever these beings were, wherever they had come from, they were now under his protection. The thought of turning them over to authorities who would cage them or study them filled him with a revulsion so strong it made him physically ill. They were beautiful, mysterious, and somehow connected to Clara in ways he didn't understand but couldn't deny. In their presence, he felt closer to his deceased wife than he had since her funeral, as if she were reaching across the boundary between life and death to offer him one final gift. The creatures seemed to sense his decision, clustering together near Clara's shawl with obvious contentment. Their musical vocalizations had taken on a different quality, warmer and more relaxed. Like the sound Clara used to make when humming lullabies she planned to sing to children who never came. Duke settled himself across the doorway with renewed purpose, no longer anxious but determined. His message was clear. Nothing would be allowed to threaten these miraculous beings while breath remained in his body. As Silas watched the creatures begin to explore their new world with growing confidence, he realized that his quiet, grief-stricken existence was over. Whether he was prepared or not, he had become the guardian of something that would change not just his life, but potentially the understanding of life itself. By the end of the first week after the hatching, the creatures had grown to the size of small deer, their development following no natural pattern Silas had ever witnessed. They seemed to absorb not just the food he offered, They showed a preference for milk and honey, accepting nothing with meat, but also something from the environment itself, drawing sustenance from sunlight and moonlight with equal satisfaction. Their resemblance to Clara had become even more pronounced as they matured, each developing distinct personality traits that reminded him of different aspects of his late wife. The first to hatch, which he'd begun thinking of as Grace, possessed Clara's quiet strength and natural authority. The second, Hope, displayed her playful spirit and gift for bringing joy to even mundane moments. The third, Faith, carried her contemplative nature and the wisdom that had made people seek her counsel during difficult times. The changes in the ranch had become impossible to hide from the outside world. Tom Crawley stopped by on a Thursday morning, ostensibly to check on the fence line they shared. But his real purpose became clear when he lingered near the house, studying the unusual vitality of Clara's long-neglected garden. Mighty strange, Tom observed, kneeling beside a rose bush that had produced blooms out of season, their petals showing colors that seemed to shift between red and gold, depending on the angle of observation. These plants looked better than they did when Clara was tending them daily. "You've been using some new kind of fertilizer." "Just keeping up with what she taught me," Silas replied, his hand instinctively moving to the chain around his neck where Clara's ring rested against his chest. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but the truth was too dangerous to share. Tom stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement in a way that reminded both men they weren't as young as they used to be. His weathered face wore an expression of concern that went deeper than curiosity about unusual plant growth. "Silas, I've known you for 20 years and I've never seen you looking so drawn. Martha's been worried sick. Says she heard Duke barking at all hours. And the Hendersons mentioned they saw lights in your house, moving around at times. That didn't make much sense." The mention of his neighbors discussing his activities sent a chill down Silas's spine. He'd been careless, too focused on protecting the creatures, to consider how his behavior might appear to outside observers. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, unusual activities drew attention, like blood drew flies. "I've been having trouble sleeping," Silas said, which was true enough. His nights were filled with dreams so vivid and meaningful that ordinary sleep seemed like a waste of precious time. "Sometimes I walk around the house when I can't rest." Tom's expression softened with sympathy. "Grief does strange things to a man's mind, Silas. After my brother died, I used to see him sitting in his favorite chair, clear as day. Martha had to convince me to give away his clothes because I kept setting a place for him at dinner." He paused, studying Silas's face with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing more than casual conversation revealed. "But this feels different. You look like a man who's seen something that changed his understanding of the world." The accuracy of that observation was so startling that Silas had to turn away, pretending to examine a fence post that needed no attention. Tom was closer to the truth than he could possibly realize, and that proximity felt dangerous in ways Silas couldn't fully articulate. Inside the house, he could sense the creature's awareness of the conversation taking place outside. Their supernatural abilities had begun manifesting in subtle ways, shadows that fell differently when they were present, the way metal objects grew warm in their vicinity, the manner in which dust motes danced in spirals around them even when the air was perfectly still. Most unsettling of all was their apparent ability to sense emotions and intentions from great distances, growing agitated whenever strangers approached the property with anything less than friendly purposes. That evening, alone in the spare bedroom with his miraculous charges, Silas found himself confronting a decision he'd been avoiding for days. The creatures were growing too quickly and becoming too obviously extraordinary to remain hidden much longer. Their presence was affecting not just his house and property, but his ability to interact normally with the human world. He'd already begun the process of isolating himself from his neighbors, declining invitations to community gatherings, and avoiding the weekly trips to town that had once provided essential social contact. But isolation would only protect them for so long. Eventually, someone would insist on checking on his welfare, or a medical emergency would force him to seek outside help, or simple bad luck would expose the creatures to someone who would react with fear rather than wonder. As if sensing his troubled thoughts, Faith approached him with the graceful, gliding movement that had replaced their initial unsteady steps. When she touched his hand with one of her delicate appendages, images flooded his mind, not the alien landscapes he'd glimpsed in the eggshells, but memories of his own past that he'd buried so deeply he'd forgotten they existed. He saw himself at 24, standing in a Union Army encampment with a rifle in his hands and eyes that had already seen too much death. He remembered the weight of responsibility he'd felt as other soldiers looked to him for leadership. The way his superiors had recognized something in him that he hadn't known he possessed, a capacity for violence when it served the cause of protection, a willingness to make hard choices when softer men would hesitate. The images shifted to show him the medal that still rested in his dresser drawer, awarded for actions during a battle whose name he rarely allowed himself to remember. He'd saved the lives of 17 men that day, not through heroic charges or dramatic gestures, but through calculated brutality, applied with surgical precision against enemies who would have shown no mercy to his comrades. Faith released his hand, and the memories faded, leaving him with a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The creatures weren't just showing him his past. They were reminding him of capabilities he'd set aside when he returned to civilian life. Skills that might prove necessary if he truly intended to protect them from a world that would never understand their nature. Over the following days, Silas began to prepare for siege conditions without fully admitting to himself what he was doing. He inventoried his ammunition supplies, checked the condition of firearms he hadn't touched since Clara's death, and studied the approaches to his property with the kind of tactical awareness he hadn't employed since his military service ended. The creatures watched these preparations with obvious understanding, their musical communications taking on tones that suggested both gratitude and concern. They seemed to comprehend that their presence had placed him in danger, but also that he had chosen to accept that risk rather than abandon them to an uncertain fate. As another week passed, Duke's behavior evolved from protective to genuinely militant. The dog had begun patrolling the property boundaries with military precision, memorizing the patterns of normal activity and growing increasingly hostile toward any deviation from established routines. When the mailman arrived 2 days late due to a broken wagon wheel, Duke's reaction was so aggressive that Silas had to physically restrain him from attack. The decision to sell his remaining cattle came to Silas on a morning when the creatures had grown large enough to require the entire spare bedroom for comfortable movement. Watching them navigate the confined space with increasing difficulty, he realized that hiding them was no longer a realistic option. They needed room to grow, to explore, to become whatever they were meant to become. More importantly, he needed to eliminate any reason for outsiders to visit his property. Jake Morrison, who ran the largest spread in the county, arrived that afternoon with a crew of riders and enough wagons to haul away the entire herd. He'd been surprised by Silas's sudden decision to liquidate his stock, but hadn't questioned the older man's judgment, especially given the generous terms of the sale. "You sure about this, Silas?" Jake had asked, as they watched his men load the last of the cattle. "These are good animals, healthy breeding stock. Seems a shame to let them go when the market's been picking up." Silas had nodded, his hand resting on the deed to the ranch that he'd retrieved from his safe that morning. The document was nearly 40 years old, signed by his father and witnessed by men who were now buried in the town cemetery. 3 generations of Boone men had worked this land, built their lives on its promise, and found their purpose in its seasonal rhythms. "A man my age shouldn't be trying to run cattle alone," he'd replied, which was true enough to pass for honest reasoning. "Better to let them go to someone who can give them proper care." But as Jake's crew drove the herd toward the main road, Silas felt as if he were watching his family's legacy disappear into dust clouds and distance. The ranch deed in his hands suddenly felt like a relic from someone else's life, a connection to ambitions and dreams that belonged to a man who no longer existed. The money from the sale would keep him comfortable for years, assuming he lived long enough to need it. More importantly, it removed the last legitimate excuse for neighbors and authorities to concern themselves with his activities. A man without livestock was simply a man living quietly on his own land, bothering no one and deserving the privacy that frontier tradition generally respected. That evening, as he watched the creatures move through the house with increasing confidence, Silas realized they had grown beyond mere physical expansion. Their supernatural abilities were manifesting in ways that defied rational explanation. Shadows bent around them when they moved, creating patterns that suggested their presence extended beyond the boundaries of their visible forms. Metal objects, buckles, horseshoes, even the iron stove in the kitchen would hum softly when they passed, as if responding to some form of energy that had no name in human science. Most remarkable of all was their apparent ability to influence the emotional atmosphere of the entire property. The ranch had always been a place of hard work and practical concerns, but now it felt somehow consecrated, as if their presence had transformed ordinary space into something approaching sacred ground. Plants grew with impossible vitality, animals behaved with unusual gentleness, and the very air seemed charged with benevolent purpose. Tom Crawley returned 3 days after the cattle sale, this time bringing his wife Martha and their teenage son Billy. Their concern was no longer casual neighborly interest, but genuine alarm about Silas's mental state. Martha had known Clara well enough to understand the depth of grief her death had caused, but she'd also known Silas long enough to recognize when his behavior crossed the line from mourning into something potentially dangerous. "Silas Boone, you look like a scarecrow," Martha announced as she stepped onto his front porch, her voice carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to managing difficult men. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal? And don't tell me those beans and hardtack constitute proper nutrition for a man your age." Behind her, Tom and Billy studied the house with the kind of attention that suggested they'd come prepared for intervention rather than casual conversation. Silas could see Billy's eyes tracking the unusual plant growth, the way shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, the subtle signs that the ranch had become something more than an ordinary homestead. "I appreciate your concern," Silas said carefully, positioning himself between his visitors and the front door. Inside, he could sense the creature's awareness of the strangers, their musical communications taking on tones that suggested readiness for flight or confrontation. "But I'm managing just fine on my own." Martha's expression hardened with the determination of a woman who'd raised 5 children through prairie winters and drought years. "Managing fine doesn't explain why you sold off healthy cattle for prices that were generous enough to be suspicious, or why Duke there looks like he's ready to take on a pack of wolves single-handed." The dog in question had positioned himself at the edge of the porch, his body language clearly communicating that visitors were no longer welcome. His loyalty to Silas remained absolute, but it had been tempered by a higher purpose that took precedence over social conventions. Tom stepped forward with the careful movements of a man trying not to provoke a confrontation. "Silas, we've been friends for 20 years. If you're in some kind of trouble, if someone's pressuring you or threatening you, we can help. The sheriff's a reasonable man, and the community takes care of its own." The mention of law enforcement sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. Sheriff Peterson was indeed reasonable, but he was also thorough and persistent. If Tom's concerns reached official attention, Silas might find himself dealing with visitors who wouldn't be deterred by claims of privacy or eccentricity. "No trouble," Silas assured them, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Just an old man making adjustments to circumstances that changed when Clara died." Sometimes it takes a while to find a new way of living, but even as he spoke, he could see doubt in their eyes. The kind of skepticism that came from caring about someone whose behavior had moved beyond the boundaries of normal grief. Martha's gaze lingered on the unusual vitality of the garden, while Billy kept glancing toward the windows as if he expected to see something remarkable looking back at him. After they left, Silas spent the evening reinforcing his defenses in ways that would have seemed paranoid just a month earlier. He checked the locks on all doors and windows, inventoried his ammunition supplies again, and began planning modifications to the ranch house that would make it more defensible if circumstances required such measures. The creatures watched his preparations with obvious understanding, their presence somehow conveying both gratitude for his protection and sorrow that such protection had become necessary. Grace approached him as he examined potential firing positions from the front windows, her touch filling his mind with memories of Clara that were so vivid they took his breath away. He saw his wife as she'd been on their wedding day, radiant with happiness and hope for the future they would build together. He remembered the way she'd looked when they'd first seen the ranch, her eyes bright with visions of children playing in the yard and gardens blooming with flowers she would plant with her own hands. He recalled her patience during the difficult years after the war, the way she'd helped him find peace with memories that had threatened to destroy his sanity, but most clearly, he remembered her final days, when the consumption had reduced her to a shadow of her former self, but hadn't dimmed the love in her eyes or the gentle strength that had sustained him through 37 years of marriage. In those last moments, she'd made him promise to find reasons to keep living, to not let grief consume what time remained to him. As the memory faded, Silas realized that the creatures represented the fulfillment of that promise in ways Clara could never have anticipated. They had given him purpose again, a reason to fight, a cause worth the risks he was taking. Whether they were angels or aliens or something that transcended such categories entirely, they had brought meaning back to a life that had been drifting toward its end without direction or hope. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced another visitor. But this time Duke's reaction was immediate and hostile. The dog's growls carried undertones of genuine menace, and through the front window, Silas could see a rider he didn't recognize, sitting too straight in his saddle, studying the ranch with the kind of professional interest that suggested official business. The rider proved to be Deputy Marshal Williams from the territorial government, a man whose presence at the ranch could only mean that Silas's activities had attracted official attention from sources beyond the local community. The marshal's questions were polite but persistent, focusing on reports of unusual lights and sounds, concerns about Silas's mental state, and the sudden sale of livestock that had been the foundation of his livelihood for decades. Nothing wrong with a man wanting privacy on his own land, Williams had acknowledged, his eyes constantly scanning the property for signs of whatever had brought him so far from town. But when that privacy starts looking like isolation, and isolation starts looking like something that might be dangerous to the individual or the community, well, that's when it becomes a matter of public concern. Silas had managed to deflect the marshal's questions without outright lying, but the encounter left him shaken. If territorial authorities were taking interest in his affairs, it was only a matter of time before more serious investigation began. The creatures would need to be moved to a more secure location, or he would need to find a way to convince the outside world that his transformation from grieving widower to reclusive hermit was nothing more than natural progression of age and loss. That night, driven by desperation and the growing certainty that time was running out, Silas climbed into the attic space above the spare bedroom. He'd avoided the cramped storage area since Clara's death, unable to face the accumulation of memories and mementos that represented their life together. But somewhere among those dusty boxes and forgotten treasures, he hoped to find something that might provide guidance for his impossible situation. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about his wife. his ranch, and the nature of the creatures he'd been protecting. Clara's journal lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a ribbon that still carried traces of her lavender perfume. The leather-bound book was thick with entries spanning nearly 15 years, beginning shortly after their marriage and continuing until just weeks before her death. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, but the content revealed a woman who had harbored secrets that went far deeper than he'd ever suspected. The first entry, dated 3 months after their wedding, described strange dreams that had begun occurring with increasing frequency. Clara wrote of visions featuring beings of light and grace who spoke without words, communicating directly with her heart and mind. Initially, she dismissed these experiences as products of an overactive imagination, but their persistence and vivid detail had gradually convinced her that something extraordinary was trying to make contact. As Silas read deeper into the journal, his understanding of his late wife underwent a fundamental transformation. The woman he'd thought he knew completely had been conducting a secret correspondence with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. The dreams had evolved into waking visions, and the visions had eventually led to actual encounters with beings who claimed to be guardians of sacred places scattered throughout the territory. According to Clara's careful documentation, the cedar stump, where Duke had first begun acting strangely, was not simply a lightning-struck tree, but an ancient marker, placed by indigenous peoples to identify ground that had been consecrated for purposes that predated European settlement by centuries. The beings she'd encountered had explained that such places required protection from those who would exploit or desecrate them, and they had chosen her as a guardian due to qualities of heart and spirit that made her suitable for the responsibility. The entries from their middle years revealed the true reason behind Clara's inability to bear children. She had been offered a choice by the guardian beings. She could live an ordinary human life, bearing and raising children in the normal manner, or she could serve a higher purpose that would require sacrifices she might not fully understand until they were demanded of her. She had chosen service, knowing it would mean loneliness and secrets that she could never share with the husband she loved more than life itself. But the most shocking revelation came in the final entries, written during Clara's illness, when she was supposed to have been too weak for anything more strenuous than sleep and gentle conversation. The consumption that had killed her had not been entirely natural in origin. Her prolonged contact with the guardian beings, while spiritually fulfilling, had gradually worn away her physical connection to the ordinary world. She had been dying slowly for years, her essence being drawn toward realms where her true companions waited. In her final entry, written in handwriting that shook with weakness but remained clear in its purpose, Clara had described a vision that explained everything Silas was now experiencing. The guardian beings had shown her a time when the sacred places would need new protectors, when the old agreements between the spiritual and physical worlds would require renewal. She had seen Silas in this vision, older and marked by grief, but also strengthened by loss in ways that would make him capable of responsibilities she had carried alone. The eggs she had written would arrive when he was ready to accept a purpose larger than his own sorrow. The beings that would hatch from them were not the same guardians she had known, but their offspring, creatures that would bridge the gap between worlds more completely than any previous generation had managed. They would need a protector who understood both human and spiritual concerns, someone who had been tested by loss and proven capable of love that transcended ordinary boundaries. As Silas finished reading the journal, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, he felt Clara's presence in the attic with an intensity that left no room for doubt. She was there, not as memory or wishful thinking, but as a continuing force in his life that death had been powerless to eliminate. Her love for him had survived the transition from physical to spiritual existence, and her guidance was still available to him if he had the wisdom to seek it. Moving carefully through the cramped space, Silas gathered other items Clara had hidden: drawings of the guardian beings rendered in remarkable detail, pressed flowers from plants that didn't grow anywhere in Wyoming Territory, and a small wooden box containing stones that seemed to hold light within their crystalline structures. Each item confirmed the reality of her secret life and the legitimacy of the responsibility he had inherited. When he climbed down from the attic, the creatures were waiting for him in the hallway, their luminous forms seeming to pulse with excitement and recognition. They had sensed Clara's presence during his discovery, and their musical communications now carried harmonics that spoke of homecoming and completion. Through their touch, he understood that they had been waiting for him to find the journal, knowing that his acceptance of their true nature would be incomplete until he understood the full scope of what had brought them together. Grace pressed against his hand, flooding his mind with images that showed the ranch as it appeared from perspectives beyond normal human perception. He saw networks of energy connecting the sacred places across the territory, streams of light that pulsed with the rhythm of seasons and the breathing of the earth itself. The cedar stump was revealed as one node in a vast web of spiritual geography, its importance extending far beyond the boundaries of his property. Hope shared visions of the future, showing him possibilities that ranged from wonder to catastrophe, depending on the choices made in the coming days. He saw the ranch transformed into a sanctuary where the boundary between worlds became permeable, allowing contact and communication that could benefit both human and guardian communities. But he also saw darker possibilities, government officials arriving with scientists and soldiers, the creatures caged and studied, the sacred places violated by those who viewed mystery as a problem to be solved, rather than a gift to be treasured. Faith's touch brought the deepest revelations of all, showing him Clara's current existence in realms where love transcended physical form and service to higher purposes provided fulfillment beyond any earthly satisfaction. She was happy, more complete than she had ever been during their physical life together, but she remained connected to him and to the ranch through bonds that would endure, until his own transition brought them together. Again, the creature's presence was not a burden imposed upon him by forces beyond his control, but a gift offered by the woman he had loved and lost, her final expression of the care that had sustained him through their years together. They were Clara's legacy made manifest, her love given form that could continue protecting what she had died to preserve. Understanding flooded through Silas with a clarity that left him breathless. He was not a victim of circumstance or the unwitting guardian of creatures whose purpose he could never comprehend. He was a chosen protector, selected by Clara's wisdom and the guardian's judgment, entrusted with responsibilities that connected him to purposes far greater than individual grief or personal loss. The ranch was no longer a failing remnant of family, tradition, but a sanctuary whose importance extended across boundaries between worlds. His isolation was not withdrawal from community, but preparation for service that few humans would ever be privileged to perform. The approaching confrontation with authorities was not a threat to be avoided, but a test of his commitment to protecting what could never be. Replaced if lost, word of Deputy Marshal Williams' visit spread through the community, faster than wildfire through dry prairie grass. By the following afternoon, concerned neighbors had begun gathering at Tom Crawley's ranch, their conversations growing more urgent as reports of Silas's strange behavior multiplied with each retelling. What had begun as genuine concern for a grieving friend was transforming into something darker, fueled by fear of the unknown and the kind of mob mentality that had driven communities to violence. Throughout the territory's short history, Martha Crawley did her best to maintain reason among the gathering crowd, but even she couldn't explain away the accumulated evidence of supernatural occurrences. Plants that bloomed out of season, lights that moved through the Boone house at impossible hours, the way animals behaved differently when approaching the ranch, all of it pointed towards something that challenged comfortable assumptions about the natural world. Maybe he's been experimenting with some kind of chemicals, suggested Bill Henderson, his voice carrying the desperate hope of a man trying to find rational explanations for irrational phenomena. Could be something left over from his army days, some kind of explosive that's affecting his mind, but Dr. Morrison, the territory's only qualified physician, shook his head grimly. I've seen men affected by various substances, both medical and otherwise. Silas shows none of the symptoms associated with poisoning or mental deterioration. Whatever's happening out there, it's not something that can be explained by conventional medicine. The conversation took a more ominous turn when Jake Morrison mentioned the unusual terms of the cattle sale. No man in his right mind sells healthy breeding stock at prices that generous unless he's desperate to get rid of them quickly. Silas acted like he was afraid of something, like those cattle represented some kind of danger to him personally. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the gathered neighbors reached a consensus that would have horrified them under normal circumstances. They would ride to the Boone Ranch in force, not as a mob seeking violence, but as a community intervention, designed to protect both Silas and themselves from whatever threat had taken root on land that had been farmed peacefully for 3 generations. Tom Crawley, despite his genuine affection for Silas, found himself reluctantly accepting leadership of the group. "We'll approach peacefully," he insisted, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations. "If Silas is in trouble, we'll help him. If he's become a threat to himself or others, we'll do what's necessary to protect everyone involved." Meanwhile, at the ranch, Silas was making preparations that drew upon knowledge and instincts he'd hoped never to use again. The creatures had demonstrated abilities that went far beyond their previous subtle manifestations, filling the house with energies that made his skin tingle and his vision sharper than it had been in decades. Under their influence, he found himself thinking with the tactical clarity that had made him an effective soldier, assessing defensive positions and potential approaches with professional competence. The cedar stump had revealed its true nature to him that morning, its ancient significance becoming visible when viewed through perception, enhanced by the creature's presence. What he had always seen as the remnant of a lightning-struck tree was actually a carefully shaped monument, its surface carved with symbols so weathered by time that they were invisible to ordinary sight. The patterns matched those he'd found in the eggshells, confirming Clara's journal entries about the site's sacred significance to indigenous peoples who had understood its importance long before European settlement. Standing beside the stump, with Faith's ethereal form beside him, Silas had experienced visions that revealed the full scope of the land's spiritual geography. The sacred site extended far beyond his property boundaries, encompassing a network of natural features that included the creek, several distinctive rock formations, and a grove of cottonwoods that had somehow survived every drought and windstorm of the past century. The entire area functioned as a single entity, a doorway between worlds, that had been maintained and protected by successive generations of guardians. The creature's true power had manifested most dramatically when a pair of wolves had approached the ranch that afternoon, drawn by scents and sounds that existed beyond normal perception. Instead of fleeing or hiding, Grace had walked directly toward the predators, her luminous form expanding until it filled their vision with light that spoke directly to their primitive understanding. The wolves had stopped mid-stride, their aggressive posture melting into something approaching reverence, before turning and fleeing toward the hills as if they'd encountered something too sacred to challenge. "They're coming," Hope communicated to him as the sun touched the horizon, her musical tones carrying urgency that needed no translation. Through her enhanced perception, she could sense the approaching riders while they were still miles from the ranch, their emotions radiating patterns of fear, determination, and reluctant resolve. Silas checked his rifles one final time, ensuring that ammunition was readily available, despite his hope that violence could be avoided. The creatures had made it clear that they possessed abilities that could end any confrontation decisively. But they preferred solutions that didn't require harming humans, who acted from ignorance rather than malice. His role as their protector included protecting others from the consequences of challenging forces they couldn't understand. As darkness fell across the prairie, Silas found himself experiencing a profound transformation that went deeper than tactical preparation or defensive planning. The grief that had defined his existence for 3 years was lifting, not disappearing, but changing into something that felt more like purpose than loss. Clara's death had not been the end of their relationship, but a transition that allowed her to guide him toward responsibilities she had carried alone for too long, standing in the spare bedroom where the creatures had hatched, surrounded by their gentle luminescence and the lingering presence of his wife's love. Silas felt complete for the first time since her funeral. The broken-down rancher who had been merely surviving was gone, replaced by a man who understood his place in a larger story that connected individual lives to purposes that transcended the boundaries of ordinary existence. Duke had positioned himself on the front porch, his aging body rigid with alertness as he monitored approaches to the house. The dog's loyalty had evolved beyond mere animal affection into something approaching religious devotion. His entire being focused on protecting the sacred against those who would profane it through ignorance or fear. The creatures themselves had grown to their full size over the past week, each now standing roughly 4 feet at the shoulder, with forms that seemed to shift between solid matter and pure energy, depending on the needs of the moment. Their resemblance to Clara had deepened rather than faded, as if her essence had been refined and purified through their development. In their presence, Silas could feel her love as strongly as he had on their wedding day, but enriched by wisdom, gained through experiences that transcended mortal understanding. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached his ears, Silas made his final preparations with the calm confidence of a man who had accepted his destiny completely. He checked the barricades he'd constructed at key windows, ensured that escape routes remained available if retreat became necessary, and spoke quietly to the creatures about the importance of restraint in the coming confrontation. "They're afraid," he told them, his voice carrying the gentle authority Clara had always used when explaining complex situations to those who lacked her understanding. "They don't know what you are or what your presence means, and fear makes people dangerous even when they don't intend to cause harm." Grace approached him with the fluid movement that characterized all their actions, her touch filling his mind with images of possible futures that branched like tributaries of a great river. He saw outcomes that ranged from peaceful resolution to tragedy that would echo through generations, all dependent on choices that would be made in the next few hours by people who had no idea of their actions' true significance. The approaching riders had reached the main road now, their torches visible through the front windows as pinpricks of light moving across the darkness. Silas counted them, 12 men from the community, armed but not aggressively so, their intentions focused on investigation rather than immediate violence. Tom Crawley rode at their head, his posture reflecting the reluctance of a man performing a duty he wished could be avoided. Behind him rode the others, Bill Henderson with his tendency toward panic, Jake Morrison, whose practical nature warred with his growing fear, Dr. Morrison, whose scientific training demanded explanations that might not exist, and 8 more men whose courage had been reinforced by numbers and torchlight, but whose resolve would be tested when confronted with realities that defied everything they thought they knew about the world. As they turned from the road onto the path leading to his house, Silas felt Clara's presence intensify, her love wrapping around him like armor that could deflect hatred while preserving the compassion that had always been her greatest strength. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he would face it as her chosen protector, defending not just the creatures she had helped bring into existence, but the sacred principles they represented. The confrontation that would determine the future of everything he now held precious was about to begin, and Silas Boone, no longer a broken-down rancher but a guardian of mysteries that connected earth to heaven, was ready to meet whatever destiny awaited him in the darkness. Beyond his door, the riders approached the ranch house with the careful deliberation of men who understood they were crossing into territory that operated by rules they didn't comprehend. Their torches cast dancing shadows across the weathered boards of the porch, where Duke maintained his vigil with the unwavering focus of a sentinel guarding sacred ground. Tom Crawley dismounted first, his movements betraying the reluctance of a man performing a duty that conflicted with decades of friendship. "Silas!" he called out, his voice carrying across the night air with forced casualness. "We need to talk. There's been concerns raised about your welfare, and we've come as friends to make sure you're all right." Behind him, the other men remained mounted, their horses showing the kind of nervous energy that animals displayed when approaching something their instincts warned them to avoid. Several of the mounts were sidestepping and tossing their heads. Despite the calm night air and familiar surroundings, Silas appeared in the doorway with his shotgun cradled in his arms, not pointed at anyone, but clearly ready for use if circumstances demanded it. The weapon had served him faithfully for 30 years, protecting his family and livestock from predators both animal and human. Now it would serve a different purpose, defending beings whose nature transcended the ordinary world's understanding of what deserved protection. "Evening, Tom," Silas replied, his voice carrying the steady calm of a man who had made peace with whatever consequences his choices might bring. "I appreciate your concern, but as you can see, I'm managing just fine on my own." Dr. Morrison dismounted next, his medical training compelling him to assess Silas's condition with professional scrutiny. "You look tired, Silas. When's the last time you had a proper night's sleep? And these reports of unusual activity, lights moving through your house at all hours, sounds that don't match anything people recognize. They've got folks worried that something might be wrong." "Nothing wrong that concerns anyone but me," Silas answered, his grip tightening slightly on the shotgun as he sensed the creatures stirring inside the house. Their awareness of the gathered men was creating atmospheric disturbances that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. Bill Henderson, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, spoke from the safety of his saddle. "Silas, we've known each other for 15 years, and I've never seen you behave like this. Selling off healthy cattle for no good reason, barricading yourself on your property, acting like you're afraid of something or protecting something that nobody else can see. It's not natural behavior for a rational man." The word rational seemed to trigger something in the house behind Silas. And suddenly, the night air filled with the musical harmonics that characterized the creature's communications. The sound was barely audible to human ears, but it carried emotional undertones that spoke directly to the primitive parts of the brain, conveying messages of warning and power that needed no translation. The horses reacted immediately, several rearing and backing away from the house, as if they'd encountered a predator whose scent triggered ancestral memories of flight. Jake Morrison's mount actually bolted, carrying its rider 50 yards down the path before he could regain control and return to the group. "What in the hell was that?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking as he rejoined the others. "That wasn't any sound made by wind or animals. That was something else entirely." Silas felt the creatures approaching the front door, their presence creating pressure waves that made his ears pop as if he were ascending a mountain too quickly. "I think it's time you gentlemen headed back to town," he said quietly. "This isn't a matter that concerns anyone but me and mine. You're mine." Tom stepped closer to the porch, his torch held high to illuminate Silas's face. "Silas, Clara's been dead for 3 years. Who exactly are you talking about?" In response to Tom's question, Grace emerged from the shadows behind Silas, her luminous form materializing like moonlight given substance and purpose. The men's torches seemed to dim in comparison to the gentle radiance she emanated, and their horses began backing away with whickers of terror that spoke of instincts older than domestication. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," whispered Dr. Morrison, his scientific training warring with evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. "What is that thing?" Before Silas could answer, Hope and faith joined Grace on the porch, their combined presence creating a tableau that seemed to bend reality around its edges. The air shimmered with energy that made distant objects appear to waver like heat mirages, and the night sounds of insects and small animals fell silent, as if all of nature was holding its breath. Several of the men wheeled their horses and fled without another word, their courage evaporating when confronted with phenomena that exceeded their ability to rationalize or comprehend. Bill Henderson was among the first to retreat, his horse carrying him toward town at a pace that suggested he wouldn't be returning with reinforcements anytime soon. Those who remained sat frozen in their saddles, caught between fear and fascination as they witnessed beings whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the world they thought they inhabited. The creatures made no aggressive moves, but their mere presence radiated power that suggested resistance would be futile and potentially catastrophic. Tom Crawley, to his credit, remained steady despite his obvious terror. "Silas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what have you gotten yourself mixed up with? Those things, they're not natural. They're not from anywhere on God's earth." "No," Silas agreed, his shotgun now resting comfortably in his arms as the immediate threat of violence receded. "They're not from our earth. But they're not the demons or devils your fear is making them out to be. They're something far more important than that, and they deserve protection rather than persecution." The standoff continued through the long hours before dawn, with the remaining men maintaining their distance while struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. The creatures remained motionless on the porch, their luminous forms serving as a barrier between the human world and whatever lay beyond ordinary understanding. Occasionally, one would tilt its head as if listening to voices only it could hear, then communicate with its companions through harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing. Dr. Morrison had dismounted despite his fear, his scientific curiosity overcoming caution as he studied the beings with the intense focus of a man trying to categorize the impossible. "Silas," he said finally, his voice hoarse from hours of silence, "I need to understand what I'm looking at. Those creatures, they're clearly intelligent, clearly not hostile despite their obvious power. But they're also clearly not from any species known to natural science. They're guardians," Silas replied, his exhaustion evident in the slight tremor of his voice. "This land, this specific place, has been sacred to someone or something for longer than any of us can imagine. Clara knew about it, had been protecting it for years before she died. Now that responsibility has passed to me and to them." Tom Crawley shook his head slowly, his practical mind struggling to accept explanations that defied everything he'd built his life upon. "Sacred to who, Silas? There haven't been Indians in this territory for decades, not since the army moved them to the reservation. Sacred to forces that were here before the Indians. Before any humans set foot on this continent," Silas answered. "Clara left journals, documentation of contact with beings that exist in places our minds can't easily reach. These three," he gestured toward the creatures, "are their offspring, born to serve as bridges between our world and theirs. Jake Morrison, who had been silent since his horse's panic-driven flight, finally found his voice. Bridges to what purpose? What do they want from us, and what happens if we can't give it to them?" In response to his question, Faith stepped forward with the fluid grace that characterized all the creature's movements. As she approached the edge of the porch, the air around her began to shimmer with images that appeared and dissolved like reflections in disturbed water. The watching men saw visions of the territory as it had existed before settlement, vast prairies teeming with life, rivers running clear and strong, skies that seemed deeper and more vibrant than anything they remembered from their own experience. The images shifted to show the same landscape as it existed now, scarred by drought, diminished by overgrazing, divided by property lines that meant nothing to the animals and natural systems that had evolved over millennia. Then came a third set of visions, showing possible futures that ranged from restoration to complete desolation. depending on choices that would be made by people who might never understand the consequences of their decisions. They're not asking for anything we can't freely give, Silas explained as the visions faded. They want to preserve places that still hold connections to something larger than human ambition. They want to maintain doorways between worlds so that wisdom can flow both ways. They're offering partnership, not conquest. Dr. Morrison stepped closer, his medical training making him sensitive to the creature's obvious benevolence despite their alien nature. The way they move, the way they communicate. There's intelligence there, but also something that feels almost maternal. They're concerned about us, aren't they? About what we're doing to ourselves and to the world we live in. Grace extended one of her delicate appendages toward the doctor, stopping just short of contact, while her luminous form pulsed with gentle invitation. When he finally worked up the courage to touch her, his expression transformed from fear to wonder as understanding flooded his consciousness. "They're healers," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Not just of bodies, but of relationships between living things. They see connections we've forgotten, understand balances we've disrupted. They want to help us remember what we've lost." The eastern horizon began to show the first hints of dawn as the confrontation entered its final phase. The creature's form seemed to grow more solid as natural light replaced torchlight, revealing details that had been obscured by their luminescence. Their resemblance to Clara became even more pronounced in the soft light of morning, but refined and perfected as if her essence had been distilled into something that transcended the limitations of mortal flesh. Hope approached Tom Crawley, her presence radiating the same gentle authority Clara had used when mediating disputes between neighbors or comforting families during times of loss. When she touched his hand, his expression softened with understanding that went deeper than words could convey. "They're not threatening us," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "They're offering to teach us things we need to know if we're going to survive what's coming. Changes in the world that we can't see yet, but that they understand because they exist partially outside of time as we experience it." Jake Morrison dismounted slowly, his earlier fear replaced by curiosity that compelled him to approach despite lingering caution. When Faith shared her visions with him, he saw his own ranch as it could become not just a place to raise cattle and crops, but part of a larger system that supported life in ways he'd never considered. As the sun cleared the horizon, bathing the ranch in golden light that seemed to intensify the creature's natural radiance, the last remnants of hostility dissolved into acceptance and wonder. The men who had come as an angry mob seeking to confront a dangerous hermit found themselves transformed into witnesses to something that challenged their understanding of reality, while offering possibilities they had never imagined. Duke left his post on the porch to greet the visitors with tail-wagging enthusiasm, his protective instincts satisfied now that the immediate threat had passed. The old cattle dog seemed to understand that these men were no longer enemies, but potential allies in protecting something precious that transcended ordinary boundaries between species, between worlds, between the possible and the impossible. 6 weeks after the confrontation that had changed everything, Silas stood at his kitchen window watching the morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been an ordinary ranch, but was now something far more significant. The new sign at the gate, hand-carved from cedar that had been blessed by the creatures themselves, read "Private Sanctuary, by invitation only," in letters that seemed to shift between English and symbols that predated any known writing system. The transformation of his property had been gradual but profound. The creek now ran clearer than it had in living memory, supporting fish species that hadn't been seen in the territory for decades. The prairie grass had grown thick and healthy, despite the continued drought that plagued neighboring ranches, creating pasturage that attracted wildlife from hundreds of miles away. Eagles nested in the cottonwoods, elk grazed peacefully near the sacred cedar stump, and at night, lights danced between the trees in patterns that followed no earthly rhythm. The creatures had grown into their role as guardians with natural grace, their presence maintaining balances that extended far beyond the boundaries of Silas's property. Grace had developed the ability to communicate directly with the migrating herds, guiding them toward water sources and safe grazing areas during their seasonal movements. Hope had become the healer Dr. Morrison had recognized during their first encounter, her touch capable of curing diseases in both animals and the occasional human visitor who arrived with ailments that conventional medicine couldn't address. Faith served as the keeper of memories, maintaining the connection between past and present that allowed the sanctuary to serve its intended purpose. As a bridge between worlds, the relationship with his neighbors had evolved from suspicion to cautious cooperation. Tom Crawley visited regularly, bringing Martha and their children to witness phenomena that challenged everything. They thought they knew about the natural world while offering hope for possibilities they'd never imagined. Dr. Morrison had become something approaching a regular resident, studying the creature's healing abilities with the dedication of a man who understood he was witnessing the birth of an entirely new branch of medicine. Even Jake Morrison had been transformed by his encounter with Faith's visions, implementing changes on his ranch that seemed to improve both his cattle's health and his land's productivity in ways that defied conventional agricultural wisdom. Word had spread carefully through the territory, attracting visitors who came seeking answers to questions they'd never known they needed to ask. The territorial authorities had eventually withdrawn their interest after Deputy Marshal Williams submitted a report that described Silas as an eccentric but harmless old rancher who posed no threat to public safety or order. The creatures had ensured that official visitors saw only what their minds could accept: unusual plant growth, uncommonly healthy wildlife, and perhaps a few tricks of light and shadow that could be attributed to atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. Silas had aged in the months since the hatching, but it was the aging of a man who had found his purpose rather than the deterioration of someone waiting for death. His shoulders were straighter, his eyes clearer, and his voice carried the authority of someone who understood his place in a larger story that connected individual lives to purposes beyond mortal comprehension. Duke had become the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, greeting visitors with the dignity of a host rather than the suspicion of a guard dog. The old cattle dog seemed to understand which guests were ready for full revelation and which needed to be introduced gradually to realities that might overwhelm less prepared minds. His presence served as a bridge between the ordinary world and the miraculous, helping humans transition from skepticism to acceptance with minimum trauma. The journal Clara had left behind had become Silas's guide for understanding the responsibilities he'd inherited, but her presence provided guidance that went beyond written instructions. He felt her approval in the way sunlight slanted through the windows of the room where the creatures had been born, heard her laughter in the musical communications that had become the soundtrack of his daily life, and sensed her love in the profound peace that had replaced the grief that had nearly destroyed him. On quiet evenings, Silas would sit on the front porch with the creatures arranged around him like living sculptures of light and grace, watching the sun set over land that had been transformed from mere property into sacred space. In those moments, he could feel the connections that linked his sanctuary to similar places scattered across the continent and beyond, a network of doorways between worlds that existed wherever humans had learned to cooperate with forces greater than individual ambition. The loneliness that had defined his existence for 3 years had been replaced by a sense of family that transcended species boundaries. The creatures were not pets or even companions in any conventional sense, but something closer to adopted children whose nature happened to extend beyond ordinary reality. They shared his meals, participated in his daily routines, and provided the kind of companionship that Clara had always insisted was essential for human well-being. Letters arrived regularly from people who had heard rumors about the sanctuary and sought permission to visit. Scientists who wanted to study phenomena they couldn't explain, spiritual seekers looking for connection to mysteries their religions had only hinted at, and ordinary individuals whose lives had reached points where conventional answers no longer sufficed. Silas evaluated each request carefully, guided by the creature's ability to sense which visitors would contribute to the sanctuary's mission and which might threaten the delicate balances they were working to maintain. As autumn approached, bringing the kind of crisp mornings that reminded him of happier times with Clara, Silas found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this unexpected destination. The broken-down rancher who had discovered mysterious eggs near a lightning-struck stump had been transformed into the guardian of something that connected earth to heaven, individual grief to universal purpose, mortal understanding to eternal wisdom. Standing in the doorway of his transformed home, watching Grace tend to an injured deer while Hope communicated with the flock of exotic birds that now considered the sanctuary their permanent residence, Silas smiled with the contentment of a man who had discovered that the end of one story could be the beginning of something far more meaningful. Clara's ring still hung around his neck, but now it felt less like a burden of grief and more like a token of continuing connection to love that transcended the boundaries between life and death. She was still with him, still guiding him, still offering the gentle wisdom that had sustained their marriage through 37 years of shared joys and sorrows. The ranch that had once been a failing remnant of family tradition had become a doorway to possibilities that few humans would ever experience. His isolation had been transformed into sanctuary, his loneliness replaced by purpose, his grief refined into wisdom that could serve needs greater than personal comfort. As Duke settled beside him on the porch, and the creatures began their evening song that seemed to harmonize with the very stars themselves, Silas Boone, no longer just a man but a guardian of mysteries, watched. The sun set over his sanctuary with the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally found his place in a story larger than any individual life, yet intimate enough to honor the love that had made such transformation possible.